The civil rights movement found great success in the South, but in the North many problems persisted for the black community. Many northern African Americans lived in ghettos and had very poor public facilities, including schools, rec centers, and other public buildings. Overall, living conditions were very poor, and it was clear that something had to be done to improve the conditions in the ghettos. Martin Luther King Jr. chose to go up north and solve this problem. When he moved up north, he decided to go to Chicago, as it was one of the world's worst areas for ghettos. Chicago was the U.S.'s second largest black city, with over 700,000 blacks living in there. In Chicago, the unemployment rate for blacks was very high, and it also suffered from many of the problems standard to northern ghettos. Also, many northern cities did not want King there, and he was specifically told not to go to Harlem or Philadelphia. Chicago also had a tradition of protest, as well as a mayor that was not a blatant racist and would possibly be sympathetic to King's cause. However, King was not very successful in Chicago. The SCLC did not come up with a particular goal in mind, so they were unable to focus down on one specific issue and actually solve it. Also, they had come unprepared for northern weather, and many of them were unaccustomed to the ghetto conditions, which were even worse than what they were used to in the South. Their lack of focus also resulted in difficulty finding enough followers, as people were not attracted to a movement with no specific purpose. Finally, in 1966, this SCLC decided to focus on the issue of housing discrimination, which prevented even somewhat successful blacks from moving out of the ghettos into nicer neighborhoods. However, some whites protested against this because they argued if blacks moved in next to them, that then they would suffer from lower land values. Because of this, many attempted to litigate this issue and failed. Overall, King's movement in Chicago was a failure, although it did attract some attention to the issue of ghettos. After his failure in Chicago, King was unsure what to do next, and some black extremists attracted a larger following, preying on King's weakness. King then shifted his focus to affirmative action, arguing that a society that had put blacks at a disadvantage for hundreds of years must do something to put him back on a level playing field. He also started the Poor People's Campaign, which attempted to eradicate poverty but failed miserably. Finally, in 1968, King was asked to come to Memphis to support black sanctioning and workers who were there protesting. The protest turned violent, and King retreated back to his hotel room. Several hours later, he was assassinated by James Earl Ray when he was on the second-floor balcony of his hotel. Throughout his life, King made many great contributions to the civil rights movement, and after his death, he was made into a martyr and a hero. Some of his more negative characteristics, such as his womanizing, were swept under the rug. Some people debate as to how important King really was to the movement. He was certainly an excellent public speaker, and he did help mobilize many people to protest. However, there were clearly other more important factors, like national organizations such as CORE and SNCC, and all of the rest of the members of the SCLC. Also, much of the credit for the change in the civil rights movement produced should go to the grassroots activists who went door to door day in and day out, spreading and promoting the civil rights movement. Overall, it is clear that King was an important member of the civil rights movement, but he himself did not make the entire movement. Although King was as important a figure in the civil rights movement, he did have some competition. Malcolm X was another important member of the CRM, more specifically, a member of the Black Power movement and the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X grew up in the North where blacks were supposedly equal, but he still suffered from poverty and discrimination. Eventually, he ended up in jail, where he joined the Nation of Islam and became an activist for the Black Power and Civil Rights movement. As a member of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X strived to improve living conditions and quality of life for Northern blacks. In the North, the Nation of Islam had as many as 25,000, no, not 25,000, 250,000 members in 1969. They created an emphasis on racial pride and delivered a message of self-confidence and economic self-help. They created many black businesses in the North and provided aid such as food and education to many black ghettos. However, the Nation of Islam was quite radical at times, and sometimes they proposed unrealistic solutions to problems. They branded King as an Uncle Tom and criticized him as ineffective. They believed that the real change had to come through violence, not peaceful protests. They also sometimes harassed police and followed them around to keep them in line. Malcolm X was involved in the Nation of Islam for a very long time, but eventually split with them after a pilgrimage to Mecca, where he was inspired by seeing Muslims of all colors live in harmony, and he began to believe that cooperation with whites was indeed possible. He also disliked Elijah Muhammad's hedonistic lifestyle, and he did not think that his main goal was to actually help blacks. In 1965, after he split from the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X was gunned down by a Nation of Islamic gunmen. Overall, Malcolm X was certainly an important figure in the civil rights movement. He was one of the leading figures with Black Power, and he had a lot of influence in the North when he was a member of the Nation of Islam, personally helping countries and many communities with day-to-day struggles. However, he was quite radical at times, and he did sometimes promote racist ideas, but he mostly changed and became a lot less radical after his pilgrimage to Mecca. MLK and Malcolm X were both important leaders of the civil rights movement, and they both had similarities and differences. Both were committed to improving the situation of blacks in America, and they both believed that this could be achieved at least partly through political means. Also, in his later years, Malcolm tended to agree with Martin more about his nonviolent strategies. However, especially before Malcolm's pilgrimage to Mecca, they also had many differences. Malcolm promoted Black Power and Black Pride, and was willing to use it and use violence if he deemed it necessary. Martin, on the other hand, believed that the best way to improve their situation and make progress was to work with whites and make changes legally, and it was strictly against violence. Overall, both were massively influential to the civil rights movement, and although at times they had different philosophies and ideas, they were always working towards the same goal.